A weary knight's heart broke watching a woman being sold like livestock in the market square. Sir Aldric had seen enough suffering in his wars to recognize it in another's eyes, and he couldn't walk away. He bought her freedom with his last gold coins, thinking he was just saving one forgotten soul. She was dirty and silent, treated as worthless by everyone else. But beneath the rags and scars was the lost princess of a fallen kingdom. Aldric becomes her protector as old enemies learn she's still alive. They want to finish what they started years ago. Can this knight and the woman he saved restore her rightful throne? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Thornwick like a shroud, masking the scars that war had left upon the land. Sir Aldric stood at the window of his modest stone manor, watching the sun struggle through the gray clouds. At 32, his face already bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much. The heavy sword at his side, its blade etched with the names of 17 fallen comrades, served as a constant reminder of the weight he carried. The kingdom of Valdris had been bleeding for nearly a decade. What began as a succession dispute had devolved into a brutal civil war that consumed noble houses like wildfire. Aldric had served faithfully under 3 different banners, each time believing he fought for justice, each time watching good men die for causes that grew murkier with every passing season. The final battle at Raven's Hollow had broken something inside him. He could still hear the screams of dying horses, still smell the copper tang of blood mixed with morning dew. That was 2 years ago. 2 years since he had laid down his sword in service to any lord and retreated to this borderland estate, a modest inheritance from his grandfather. The land was poor, suitable only for sheep and hardy vegetables, but it was honest work. Banners to follow, no oaths that would lead young men to early graves. Another restless night, my lord? Aldric turned to find Martha, his housekeeper, standing in the doorway with a steaming cup of herbal tea. She was a widow in her 50s, her graying hair always pulled back in a practical bun. When Aldric had first arrived at Thornwick, the manor had been empty for years, but Martha had appeared the next morning as if summoned by some divine providence, declaring that the place needed a firm hand and proper management. The dreams again, Aldric admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. The tea was Martha's own blend: chamomile, lavender, and something else she refused to identify. It helped, though never enough to chase away the faces that visited him in sleep. "You're thinking of riding to Millhaven today," Martha observed. It wasn't a question. After 2 years, she could read his moods like scripture. Aldric nodded. "We need supplies. Salt, iron nails, seed for the spring planting." He paused, then added quietly, "And I need to see people again. Real people, not the ghosts that haunt this place." Martha's expression softened. She had lost her own husband to the war, not in battle, but to the fever that followed when wounded soldiers brought disease to their village. She understood the need to fight isolation, even when solitude felt safer. "Take Thomas with you," she suggested. "The boy could use the experience, and you could use the company." Thomas was Martha's nephew, barely 18 and eager to prove himself useful. He had arrived at Thornwick 6 months ago, another refugee from a war-torn village. Aldric had been reluctant to take him in. He preferred his solitude, but Martha had insisted. And she was rarely wrong about such things. The ride to Millhaven took most of the morning. Thomas chattered endlessly about everything and nothing: the weather, the condition of the roads, gossip from neighboring farms. Aldric found himself almost smiling despite his mood. The young man's enthusiasm was infectious, a reminder that not everyone had been crushed by the weight of recent years. Millhaven was one of the few towns that had prospered during the chaos. Positioned along the main trade route between the capital and the southern provinces, it had managed to remain nominally neutral. paying taxes to whoever controlled the region at any given time. The merchants were pragmatic folk who cared more about profit than politics, a philosophy Aldric had come to appreciate. The market square buzzed with activity. Farmers hawked their produce while traveling merchants displayed exotic goods from distant lands. Children ran between the stalls, their laughter mixing with the calls of vendors and the general din of commerce. For a moment, Aldric allowed himself to imagine this was how life had always been: peaceful, prosperous, normal. That illusion shattered when he saw the slave auction. A crude wooden platform had been erected near the town's central fountain. A fat merchant in expensive robes stood atop it, gesturing theatrically as he described the merchandise to a small crowd of onlookers. 3 people stood chained to iron posts, 2 men and a woman. The men appeared to be laborers, broad-shouldered and sullen. But it was the woman who drew Aldric's attention. She might have been beautiful once. Even now, beneath the dirt and tangled hair, he could see fine bone structure and intelligent eyes. But those eyes held a depth of suffering that made Aldric's chest tighten. She stood perfectly still, head slightly bowed, as if she had retreated so far inside herself that the world could no longer touch her. Her clothes were little more than rags, and angry red marks on her wrists suggested the shackles had been there for a long time. "Strong backs, willing hands," the merchant called out. "Perfect for farm work or household duties. We start the bidding at 5 silver pieces for the lot." The crowd's interest was lukewarm. Times were hard and slaves were expensive to maintain. A few half-hearted bids were called out, but nothing that seemed to excite the merchant. "Come now, good people." He tried again. "These are quality slaves, recently acquired from the eastern provinces. The woman may look worn, but she's young, enough to bear children, and the men." "I'll take just the woman," a voice called out. Aldric realized with surprise that it was his own. Thomas shot him a startled look, but Aldric was already pushing through the crowd toward the platform. The merchant's eyes lit up with sudden interest. Ah, a discerning buyer. Yes, she's a fine specimen, despite appearances. Exotic features. Probably noble blood somewhere in her lineage. Very quiet and obedient. Hasn't spoken a word since we acquired her. Perfect for a gentleman who values discretion. The words made Aldric's stomach turn. He could see the calculation in the merchant's eyes, the casual assessment of human worth. Measured only in coins. How much? For a private sale? 20 silver pieces. It was highway robbery, and they both knew it. But as Aldric looked at the woman, really looked at her, he saw something that made his decision for him. There, just for an instant, her eyes met his. In that brief contact, he glimpsed not just pain, but a fierce intelligence that refused to be broken despite everything she had endured. Done. He reached for his purse, counting out the last of his traveling money. It was meant to purchase supplies for the entire spring season, but somehow that no longer seemed important. The transaction was completed with businesslike efficiency. Papers were signed, ownership transferred, and the woman's shackles were unlocked. With a rusty key, she stood quietly throughout the process, never speaking, never looking directly at anyone. When it was finished, she simply waited, as if unsure what was expected of her. "Come," Aldric said gently. "You're free now." She followed him through the market, Thomas trailing behind with obvious bewilderment. They had reached the horses before. The young man finally found his voice. "Sir Aldric, forgive me, but what are we going to do with her? We can't afford another mouth to feed, and Martha will have our heads if we bring home a stranger without warning." Aldric was asking himself the same questions, but seeing the woman's bare feet and the way she flinched at sudden noises, he knew there had been no choice. "We'll manage," he said simply, "and Martha will understand." The ride back to Thornwick passed in silence. The woman, he would need to learn her name, rode Thomas's horse while the young man walked alongside. shooting curious glances at their unexpected companion. She sat straight in the saddle despite her obvious exhaustion, and Aldric noticed that her hands, though scarred, held the reins with practiced ease. Not a common farm girl, then. When they reached the manor, Martha took one look at their guest and immediately sprang into action. Within minutes, she had prepared a bath, laid out clean clothes, and begun heating soup in the kitchen. If she had questions about this sudden addition to their household, she kept them to herself for the moment. "What's your name?" Aldric asked gently as they stood in the manor's main hall. The woman looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable. Then she simply shook her head and turned away. "She hasn't spoken since they acquired her," Thomas repeated the merchant's words. "Maybe she can't." But Aldric had seen something in her expression, not inability, but choice. Whatever had happened, to her, whatever she had endured, silence had become her shield. He would not force her to lower it until she was ready. That evening, as the woman slept in the small guest chamber Martha had prepared, Aldric sat in his study examining the bill of sale. The merchant's script was barely legible, but one detail caught his attention. The date of acquisition was recent, only 3 weeks past. Before that, there was no record of ownership, just a notation that she had been recovered from bandits operating near the Thornwood border. The Thornwood. Aldric knew that region well. It had been the site of several major battles during the early years of the Civil War. Many noble families had fled there when their lands were overrun, and not all of them had survived. Bandits and deserters still roamed those forests, preying on anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. He studied the woman's description again. Approximately 28 years of age, dark hair, distinctive birthmark on left shoulder. The merchant had been thorough in his documentation, treating her like livestock being cataloged for inventory. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. The woman's bearing, her obvious education despite her circumstances, the way she held herself even in chains, it all suggested a background far removed from common slavery. And that birthmark the merchant had noted might be significant if it had matched any known noble house markings. Aldric rose and walked to his bookshelf, pulling down a volume on heraldry that had belonged to his grandfather. If his suspicions were correct, if this woman was indeed from noble stock displaced by the war, then her presence at Thornwick might complicate things considerably. But as he began leafing through the pages of family crests and bloodline histories, he found he didn't care. For the first time in 2 years, he had acted decisively to help another human being. Whatever consequences that action might bring, at least he had done something right. Outside his window, the mist was beginning to lift from the hills, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, one more lost soul had found sanctuary at Thornwick Manor. The woman slept for nearly 2 full days. Martha checked on her regularly, reporting that she barely stirred except to accept small sips of broth or water. When she finally emerged from the guest chamber, clean and dressed in one of Martha's spare gowns, the transformation was remarkable. The dirt and grime had hidden features that spoke of noble breeding, high cheekbones, graceful hands, and eyes that held depths of intelligence despite their haunted quality. She moved through the manor like a ghost, accepting food when offered, but never speaking, never making requests. Aldric found her once standing before the window in the main hall, staring out at the rolling hills with an expression of profound loss. When he approached, she didn't acknowledge his presence, but he noticed her hands trembling slightly as they gripped the windowsill. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one will hurt you again." She turned then, studying his face with those penetrating dark eyes. For a moment, he thought she might speak, but instead she simply nodded once and retreated to her chamber. It was Martha who made the discovery that changed everything. On the 3rd morning, she knocked urgently on Aldric's study door. "Sir, "You need to see this," she said, her voice tight with excitement and concern. Aldric followed her to the guest chamber, where she had prepared fresh linens and a change of clothes. The woman was nowhere to be seen. Martha explained she was in the kitchen, having finally shown interest in helping with simple tasks. "When I helped her bathe yesterday, I noticed something," Martha said, pointing to the discarded nightgown on the bed. "Look at her shoulder, where the fabric was torn." Aldric examined the garment and saw what had caught Martha's attention. There, on the left shoulder area, were faint stains that could only be blood, not from wounds, but from something that had been deliberately marked or branded into the skin. "She has a birthmark," Martha continued, lowering her voice. "But it's not natural, sir. It's been scarred over, like someone tried to burn it away. But the shape is still visible underneath." "What shape?" "A dragon, sir. Coiled and rampant, just like—" Martha didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Aldric felt the blood drain from his face as understanding crashed over him. He strode quickly to his study and pulled the heraldry volume from its shelf, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. There, rendered in faded ink, was the royal coat of arms of House Drakmore. A dragon coiled and rampant, identical to what Martha had described. The same house that had ruled Valdres for 3 centuries until the Civil War began. The same family that had been massacred in their beds 7 years ago, their bodies burned and their bloodline declared extinct, all except for one member who had never been found. Princess Elara Drakmore, youngest daughter of King Aldric III, had been 21 when the palace fell. Her body was never recovered from the ruins, leading to persistent rumors that she had escaped the slaughter. But as years passed without any sign of her, most assumed she had died in the wilderness or been killed by bandits. Yet here she was, bearing the unmistakable mark of royal blood, broken and silent in his guest chamber. Aldric sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the implications. If this woman truly was Princess Elara, then the political ramifications were staggering. Several noble houses currently vied for control of the throne, each claiming legitimacy through distant bloodlines or marriage contracts. The return of a true Drakmore heir would upset every carefully laid plan, threaten every ambitious lord's claim to power. No wonder someone had tried to burn away her birthmark. No wonder she had been found with bandits who specialized in making people disappear. He spent the rest of the morning researching everything he could remember about the royal family. Princess Elara had been known for her intelligence and musical talents. She spoke 4 languages fluently and had been personally tutored by the kingdom's finest scholars. Unlike her older brothers, who focused on martial pursuits, she had been groomed for diplomacy and statecraft. There had been talk of an engagement to a prince from a neighboring kingdom, part of her father's efforts to secure peaceful borders through marriage alliances. But the war had ended all such plans, leaving her fate unknown until this moment. Around midday, Aldric ventured to the kitchen, where he found the woman helping Martha prepare vegetables for the evening meal. Her movements were precise and economical, suggesting familiarity with domestic work skills no princess would have learned in the palace, but which she had obviously acquired during her years of captivity. "Martha tells me you're quite helpful," Aldric said, settling into a chair at the wooden table. The woman glanced up briefly, then returned to her work without responding. "I've been wondering about your past," he continued carefully. "The merchant said you were taken from bandits near Thornwood. That's dangerous country. Many noble families sought refuge there during the early years of the war." This time, her hands stilled completely. The knife she held trembled slightly before she set it down and stepped back from the table. "It's all right," Aldric said quickly. "Whatever happened to you, whatever you've endured, you don't have to speak of it until you're ready. But I want you to know that some secrets are heavier when carried alone." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or hope. But still she remained silent. That evening, as Martha served dinner, Aldric noticed their guest observing everything with keen attention. She watched how Martha moved through the familiar routine, how Thomas recounted his day with the sheep, how Aldric himself sat at the head of the table with unconscious authority. It was the careful observation of someone assessing a situation, gathering information. After the meal, he found her in the main hall again, this time examining the family portraits that lined the walls. She stood before a painting of his grandfather, Sir Edmund, who had served as a royal knight during more peaceful times. He fought at the Battle of Silver Ford, Aldric said, joining her. Saved the king's life, according to family stories. My grandmother always said he was too honorable for his own good. The woman's breath caught sharply. She turned to stare at Aldric, her eyes wide with something that might have been recognition. Did you know him? Aldric asked gently. For a long moment, she simply looked at him. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke her first words since arriving. At Thornwick, he had kind eyes. Her voice was roughened from disuse but unmistakably refined. The accent carried traces of court education, confirming what Aldric had already begun to suspect. Yes, he agreed. Everyone said that about him. He died when I was 12, but I remember. She was already retreating, the moment of connection. Broken as quickly as it had formed, but it was enough. Those 3 words had confirmed what the birthmark and her bearing had only suggested. Princess Alara Drakmore was alive, and she was standing in his home. That night, Aldric barely slept. He walked the halls of Thornwick, his mind racing with the magnitude of what he had discovered. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and he found himself checking the windows obsessively, suddenly aware of how exposed his manor was, how easily watched. If he had recognized her, others might as well. The merchant who sold her had documented that birthmark, and such records had a way of finding their way into the wrong hands. Every moment she remained at Thornwick increased the danger, not just to her, but to everyone under his roof. Yet where could she go? She was broken, traumatized, barely functional. And after 7 years of believing herself forgotten, learning to trust again would take time. He wasn't sure they had thought by morning. He had made his decision. Princess or not, she was under his protection now. Whatever forces had tried to destroy her bloodline, whatever enemies still hunted the Drakmore name, they would have to go through him first. The war had taken everything from him, his ideals, his friends, his faith in causes greater than himself. But perhaps, in protecting this broken woman, he could find something worth fighting for again. As dawn broke over the hills of Thornwick, Aldric stood watch at his window, one hand resting on the sword that bore the names of fallen comrades. Somewhere out there, old enemies were stirring. The Game of Thrones had gained a new player, whether she knew it or not. And this time, he would not let the innocent pay the price for the ambitions of the powerful. The breakthrough came through music. Aldric had noticed how she startled at sudden sounds, a door slamming, raised voices, even the clatter of cooking pots. The quieter sounds seemed to calm her, the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance, Martha humming while she worked, or the soft scratch of his quill when he worked on estate accounts in the evenings. It was Thomas who suggested trying music deliberately. The young man had inherited his uncle's talent for the lute and often played in the evenings to entertain the household. He had noticed how their mysterious guest would pause in whatever task she was performing whenever he practiced, though she always retreated if he acknowledged her presence. Perhaps she would stay if we didn't make it seem like a performance, Thomas suggested. Just play as if for ourselves. That evening, as they gathered in the main hall after dinner, Thomas began a gentle melody, an old court ballad that had been popular before the war. Aldric recognized it vaguely, something about star-crossed lovers and distant kingdoms. The woman sat in her usual corner, mending one of Martha's aprons with careful, precise stitches. At first, nothing seemed different. But as Thomas continued, Aldric noticed her hands had stilled. She was listening intently, her head tilted slightly, as if trying to catch every note. When the song ended, she looked up directly at Thomas for the first time since arriving. "Do you know the Nightingale's Lament?" she asked, her voice still barely above a whisper. Thomas's eyes widened. Yes, my lady, though I haven't played it in years. It's quite complex. My mother used to sing it," she said simply, then returned to her sewing as if the moment had never happened. But it was a beginning. Over the following days, Thomas began including more complex pieces in his repertoire. Each evening brought new responses, sometimes just increased attention, sometimes a whispered request for a particular song. Gradually, the woman began to join them earlier in the evening, no longer retreating to her chamber. Immediately after meals, Martha observed these changes with the shrewd eye of someone who had raised children through difficult times. "She's like a flower that's been kept in darkness too long," she told Aldric one morning. "Give her warmth and patience, and she'll bloom again. But try to force it, and she'll wither." The housekeeper had taken a particular interest in their guests' recovery. She introduced gentle tasks, first the mending, then help with bread making, and gradually more complex household duties. The woman approached each new responsibility with the same careful precision, as if each completed task was a small victory against whatever demons haunted her. Aldric found himself watching these small progressions with an intensity that surprised him. When she smiled briefly at something Martha said, or when her shoulders relaxed slightly during the evening music, he felt a warmth he hadn't experienced since before the war. It was dangerous territory. He was becoming emotionally invested in her recovery in ways that went beyond simple hospitality. The revelation of her true identity made everything more complicated. Should he tell her that he knew? Did she remember who she was, or had trauma buried those memories along with her? Voice? Sometimes he caught her staring at the royal portraits with an expression of puzzled recognition, as if trying to solve a riddle whose answer danced just beyond reach. Dr. Garrett arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, summoned by a message Aldric had sent to the neighboring village. The elderly physician had tended the Thornwick family for decades and could be trusted with sensitive matters. He was also one of the few doctors who had experience treating those who had suffered prolonged captivity during the war. "Shell shock," he declared after a careful examination. "I've seen it in soldiers who endured long sieges, prisoners who suffered extended interrogation. The mind builds walls to protect itself from unbearable memories. Will she recover fully?" Aldric asked as they spoke privately in his study. "The fact that she's begun speaking again is encouraging. Music therapy was wise. I've seen it help. Others reconnect with parts of themselves they thought lost. But forcing the process could do more harm than good." Dr. Garrett fixed Aldric with a stern look. "There's something else, isn't there? Something you're not telling me about this woman's background." Aldric hesitated. Dr. Garrett had served noble families long enough to recognize quality when he saw it, and their guest's bearing was unmistakably aristocratic despite her circumstances. "She may be someone of importance," Aldric said carefully. "Someone whose disappearance was noted." "Ah," the doctor nodded slowly. "Then you're walking a dangerous path, my friend. If powerful people wanted her gone once, they may not appreciate her return to health and memory." That evening brought an unexpected test of the progress she had made. Thomas had been experimenting with a particularly complex piece of royal processional that required intricate fingering and perfect timing. He stumbled over a difficult passage, cursing softly under his breath. "The third measure should be played more slowly," came a quiet voice from the corner, "and the trill in the fifth measure extends for 4 beats, not 3. Thomas looked up in surprise. "You know this piece?" She nodded, then seemed to realize she had spoken without thinking. A flush crept up her neck, and she started to rise from her chair. "Please," Thomas said quickly. "Would you show me?" I've been struggling with it for weeks." For a moment, she wavered between retreat and engagement. Then, slowly, she moved to where Thomas sat with his lute. With gentle hands, she guided his fingers to the correct positions, her touch light but confident. "Like this," she murmured. And suddenly, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to teaching, to being listened to. The melody represents a ceremonial entrance, so each note must be precise, deliberate. As Thomas played the corrected passage, something shifted in her expression. Memory flickered behind her eyes, not the painful kind that sent her fleeing, but something warmer, more distant. "Better," she said softly. "Much better." When the song ended, she remained standing beside Thomas instead of immediately retreating. Martha beamed from her chair by the fire, and Aldric felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Later, as the household prepared for bed, Aldric found her in the main hall again, this time standing before a different portrait, one of his father in full court dress. "He served in the royal guard," Aldric said quietly, joining her. "I thought so," she replied. "His stance, the way he holds his sword, is the traditional ceremonial position." She paused, then added almost to herself, "I remember the changing of the guard, the precision of it, the pageantry." It was the most she had revealed about her past, and Aldric chose his next words carefully. Those were different times, more peaceful. "Yes," she agreed, her voice heavy with loss. "Before everything burned." The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. But before Aldric could respond, she had already begun her nightly retreat to the guest chamber. Progress. He reflected as he watched her go. Slow, fragile progress. But for the first time since bringing her to Thornwick, he allowed himself to hope that the broken woman he had rescued might someday reclaim not just her voice, but her life. The first sign of trouble came with the arrival of Lady Catherine Blackwood. Aldric was working in the stables when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the wide doors, he watched a small entourage crest the hill leading to Thornwick. 2 guards, a servant, and a woman riding side saddle on a magnificent chestnut mare. Even at a distance, he recognized the straight-back posture and confident bearing. Catherine had been his betrothed once, in the years before the war changed everything. The engagement had been arranged by their families, but genuine affection had grown between them during their courtship. She was intelligent, beautiful, and well-connected at court, everything a knight could want in a wife. But when Aldric chose to abandon his military career and retreat to Thornwick, she had chosen to remain in the capital and pursue other opportunities. He hadn't seen her in over a year. "Sir Aldric," she called out as her party approached the manor, "I hope you don't mind an unexpected visit." She dismounted gracefully, her traveling dress immaculate despite the long ride. Catherine had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to appear perfectly composed, regardless of circumstances. "Lady Catherine," he replied, moving forward to greet her properly. "You're always welcome at Thornwick, though I confess I'm surprised to see you so far from court." "I have business in the eastern provinces," she explained, accepting his assistance down from her horse. "Lord Pemberton requires someone to negotiate new trade agreements with the merchant guilds. When I learned my route would take me near your estate, I couldn't resist the opportunity to see how you're faring in your self-imposed exile." Her smile was warm, but Aldric caught the subtle edge in her voice. Catherine had never forgiven him for abandoning what she considered a promising career. In her worldview, retreat was equivalent to surrender, and surrender was a luxury the nobility couldn't afford during times of crisis. "I'm doing well," he said simply. "Come, let me have Martha prepare rooms for you and your people." As they walked toward the manor, Catherine studied the grounds with the appraising eye of someone accustomed to evaluating property and status. "You've made improvements," she observed. "The stables look new, and the gardens are well maintained." "I've had time to focus on such things." "And motivation, perhaps?" There was something knowing in her tone that made Aldric glance at her sharply. "I heard an interesting story in Millhaven yesterday about a certain knight who made an unusual purchase at the slave market." Aldric felt ice form in his stomach, but kept his expression neutral. News travels quickly in small towns, especially when the purchaser is someone of notable reputation. The merchant was quite chatty about the transaction. Apparently, the woman had some interesting characteristics. A birthmark, specifically. They had reached the manor's front entrance, but Catherine paused before going inside. Her next words were spoken quietly, meant for his ears alone. "Be careful, Aldric. There are forces at court who pay attention to such details. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep." Before he could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing Catherine again. Whatever political undercurrents whirled around their unexpected guest, the housekeeper had always been fond of her. "My lady, what a wonderful surprise. I'll have your usual room prepared immediately." As Martha bustled about arranging accommodations, Aldric found himself watching the manor with new eyes. Where was their other guest? He spotted her through the kitchen window, helping with preparations for the evening meal. She had pulled her hair back and wore one of Martha's simpler dresses. She could easily be mistaken for a servant at casual glance. But Catherine was not given to casual glances. Dinner that evening was a study in carefully maintained civility. Catherine regaled them with news from the capital, which nobles were rising in influence, which trade routes had been reopened, and the ongoing diplomatic efforts to establish a more stable government. She was careful to include everyone in the conversation, drawing out Thomas with questions about local farming conditions and complimenting Martha on the excellent roast. Their mysterious guest served at table, moving quietly and efficiently around the dining room. Catherine observed her with subtle attention, noting her graceful movements and the way she anticipated needs without being asked. "Your household runs very smoothly," Catherine commented to Aldric. "Your staff seems exceptionally well-trained." "We're a small household," Aldric replied. "Everyone contributes where they can." "Indeed." Catherine's gaze followed their guest as she refilled wine glasses. "How fortunate that you found someone so naturally suited to service." The comment was delivered with perfect innocence, but Aldric caught the slight emphasis on naturally suited. Catherine was fishing, trying to determine whether he recognized the true worth of what he had acquired after dinner. As was customary, they gathered in the main hall. Thomas brought out his lute, but the atmosphere was more formal with Catherine's presence. She herself was an accomplished musician and took turns playing pieces from the current court repertoire. "Do you know The Dragon's Lament?" Catherine asked, her fingers poised over the lute strings. It was a subtle test. The piece was a recent composition, written to commemorate the fall of House Drakmore. Only someone with court connections would know it, and only someone with a personal connection to the royal family would react strongly to hearing it. Aldric watched their guest carefully as Catherine began a haunting melody. At first, there was no visible reaction, but as the song progressed, telling the story of a kingdom's fall and a bloodline's end, he saw her hands begin to tremble. Her face had gone pale, and she gripped the arms of her chair as if fighting the urge to flee. Catherine continued playing, her eyes fixed on the strings, but her attention clearly focused on their guest's reaction. When she reached the final verse, the one describing the princess who vanished without a trace, their guest rose abruptly and excused herself for the evening. "Interesting," Catherine murmured as footsteps faded up the stairs. "Your servant seems to have quite sensitive musical tastes." "Some songs carry difficult memories," Aldric said carefully. "The war affected everyone differently." "Indeed it did." Catherine set aside the lute and fixed him with a direct stare. "But some people were affected more than others, and some disappearances were more notable than others." The conversation had moved beyond subtlety into dangerous territory. Aldric found himself calculating distances to weapons, escape routes, the loyalty of his household staff. Catherine was many things, but she wasn't malicious, yet her presence here could hardly be coincidental. "What do you want, Catherine?" "The same thing I've always wanted," she replied. "For you to make smart choices. For you to understand the implications of your actions before they destroy you." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are people at court who know she's alive. People who have been searching for her since the night she disappeared. If you think you can keep her hidden here indefinitely, you're being naive. And what would you suggest? Return her to those who can properly protect her, or properly dispose of her, depending on which outcome serves the realm's stability." The casual way she spoke of disposal made Aldric's blood run cold. This was the court mindset he had grown to despise: human lives measured only by their political utility. "She stays here," he said firmly. Catherine sighed, the sound carrying genuine regret. "Then you're choosing a path that leads to war, my dear friend. Because that's what her existence represents, another excuse for ambitious men to tear the kingdom apart." "Maybe," Aldric agreed, "but some things are worth fighting for, even if it costs you everything, especially then." Catherine studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I see. Well, then I suppose I should warn you. You have perhaps a week before certain interested parties arrive to investigate the rumors from Millhaven. Use that time wisely." As she rose to retire for the evening, she paused at the foot of the stairs. "For what it's worth, Aldric, I hope you know what you're doing, because the stakes have never been higher." Long after the manor had settled into quiet, Aldric sat in his study, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Outside, the wind carried the first hints of an approaching storm. Whether meteorological or political, he couldn't say, but he suspected both were heading for Thornwick. Catherine departed the next morning with polite farewells and meaningful glances, but not before slipping a sealed letter into Aldric's hands when no one else was watching. "From a mutual friend," she said quietly. "Someone who shares your humanitarian interests." Aldric waited until her entourage had disappeared over the hill before breaking the seal. The message was brief and written in code, but he recognized both the hand and the cipher. Lord Marcus Thorne, one of the few nobles who had remained neutral during the worst years of fighting. "The ravens gather at court," the decoded message read. "Vance leads the hunt. The dragon's child must learn to fly or all will burn again. Trust no one who profits from chaos. Lord Vance." Aldric remembered the name from military briefings during the war. A peer, minor noble who had risen to prominence through strategic marriages and carefully timed betrayals. He'd been one of the first to declare House Drakmore extinct, and had profited handsomely from the redistribution of royal lands. If Vance was organizing a search, it meant the rumors from Millhaven had reached the highest levels of the current power structure. That afternoon, Aldric made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. He found their guest in the garden, tending to Martha's herb plots with the same careful attention she brought to every task. "We need to talk," he said gently, "about who you are and who I believe you to be." She looked up from the lavender she was pruning, her dark eyes wary but no longer automatically fearful. The weeks at Thornwick had begun to heal some of the damage, though Aldric knew that deeper wounds would take much longer to mend. "I know about the birthmark," he continued. "I know about the royal dragon of House Drakmore, and I believe you know that I know." For a long moment, she simply stared at him. Then, slowly, she set down her pruning shears and brushed soil from her hands. "I wondered when you would say something," she admitted, her voice steadier than he had ever heard it. "You've been watching me the way one watches a dangerous animal, with caution and calculation." "Not dangerous," Aldric corrected. "Important." There's a difference. She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Important? I'm a broken woman who forgot how to speak for 3 years. I flinch at shadows and wake screaming from nightmares. Whatever importance I once held died with my family. Your family's blood runs in your veins. Your father's crown may have been destroyed, but the right to wear it passes to you. Rights. She spoke the word like a curse. Do you know what rights meant when they dragged me from the burning palace? When they branded my shoulder to destroy the mark of my birth? She stopped abruptly, her face pale. Aldric stepped closer, his voice gentle. Whatever they did to you, whatever you suffered, it doesn't change who you are. You are Princess Elara Drakmor, rightful heir to the throne of Valdris. I am a woman who has learned to disappear, she corrected. Who has learned that survival matters more than titles or blood or rights. She picked up the shears again, her movement sharp and agitated. Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? I want you to understand the danger we're all in. Lord Vance knows you're alive. He's organizing a search, and they'll be here within days. The shears slipped from her hands, clattering to the stone path. Vance, she whispered. And Aldric saw true terror flicker across her features for the first time since her recovery began. You know the name. He was there, she said, so quietly he had the strain to hear. The night my family died. He stood beside my uncle as they decided my fate. Her hands were shaking now, and she wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold together something that threatened to break apart. He wanted to kill me immediately, but my uncle convinced him I might be useful as a bargaining chip with neighboring kingdoms. Your uncle? Regent Prince Aldric, named for your grandfather, ironically. My father's younger brother. The words came out flat, emotionless, as if she were reciting a lesson learned through repetition. He orchestrated the entire thing. The massacre, the power grab, the elimination of anyone with a stronger claim to the throne. The revelation hit Aldric like a physical blow. The current regent, the man who had spent 7 years consolidating power and claiming to hold the throne in trust for a future legitimate heir, was the architect of the very massacre that had supposedly necessitated his rule. And Vance was his partner in this? More than a partner. Vance provided the mercenaries, the political connections, the financial backing. In return, he received titles, lands, and influence that would have been impossible under my father's rule. She met Aldric's eyes, and he saw in them a pain deeper than physical torture. They let me live because they thought a captive princess might someday be worth more than a dead one. But when no opportunities arose to use me, they sold me to slavers, with instructions to make me disappear permanently. But you survived. I survived. She picked up the fallen shears, her movements now steady and deliberate. And now they know it, which means they'll come to finish what they started. Aldric felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders, the same feeling he had experienced before every major battle during the war. The comfortable isolation of Thornwick was about to end, and the choices he made in the coming days would determine not just his own fate, but that of everyone under his protection. Then we need to be ready for them, he said simply. We? She looked at him with something that might have been hope. You would risk your life for a woman who brings nothing but danger to your household? You bring more than danger, Aldric replied. You bring the possibility of justice, of ending the cycle of violence and betrayal that has consumed this kingdom for nearly a decade. I don't know how to be a princess anymore, she said quietly. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything other than afraid. Then we'll start with something simpler, Aldric suggested. We'll start with staying alive. That evening, he began her training in earnest. Not the courtly accomplishments she had once mastered, but the practical skills that might keep her breathing if diplomacy failed. Basic sword work, defensive tactics, how to read the approach of hostile riders, thought to his surprise. She proved an apt student. Trauma had made her hypervigilant, but it had also sharpened instincts that peacetime nobility rarely developed. She could detect the approach of strangers from remarkable distances, identify weapons by sound alone, and move with a silence that spoke of hard-learned lessons in remaining unnoticed. Muscle memory, she explained when he commented on her natural, defensive posture. 3 years of learning that survival depends on being ready for anything. As they worked together in the manor's courtyard, something began to shift between them. The careful politeness of host and guest evolved into something deeper, a partnership forged by shared danger and mutual respect. When their practice swords crossed, when he corrected her stance with gentle touches, when she demonstrated how to disappear into shadows, the air between them carried a tension that had nothing to do with combat training. But there was no time to explore such feelings. The storm Catherine had warned about was approaching, and they had precious little time to prepare for its arrival. They came at dawn on the 5th day, just as Catherine had predicted. Aldric was in the stables checking on his horse when Thomas burst through the doors, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Sir, riders approaching from the east. At least a dozen, armed and moving fast." Aldric had been expecting this moment, but the reality still sent ice through his veins. "Get Martha and the princess to the root cellar. There's a hidden passage that leads to the old mine shaft. Show them the way and stay with them until this is over." "What about you? I'll buy you time." Aldric was already moving, checking his sword and gathering the weapons he had prepared over the past few days. "If I don't come for you by sunset, take the princess and head for Lord Thorne's estate. He can be trusted." Thomas started to protest, but Aldric cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Go, now." The young man nodded reluctantly and sprinted toward the manor. Aldric took a moment to steady himself, feeling the familiar calm that always descended before battle. He had fought in dozens of engagements during the war, but never with stakes. This personal dot, by the time the riders crested the hill overlooking Thornwick, Aldric stood waiting in the manor's front courtyard. He had positioned himself carefully close enough to the building to use it for cover, but far enough away to draw any fighting away from the hidden cellar entrance. The mercenaries were professional. That much was clear from their formation and equipment. They wore no obvious badges or colors, but their leader carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. As they approached, Aldric counted 13 riders, all armed with military-grade weapons. "Sir Aldric of Thornwick," the leader called out as they reined in their horses 30 paces away. "I am Captain Rourke, here on official business for the crown." "What business might that be?" Aldric replied, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "We're investigating reports of stolen property. A woman was illegally purchased from licensed slavers and brought to this estate. We're here to recover her and return her to proper custody." "I purchased no stolen property." The transaction was legitimate, with proper documentation. Captain Rourke smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Why don't you produce the woman in question, and we can sort this out peacefully?" "She's not here." "I think she is." Rourke gestured, and half his men began spreading out to surround the manor. "My orders are quite specific. The woman is to be recovered, and anyone harboring her is to be considered an enemy of the crown." Aldric drew his sword in one smooth motion. "Then I suppose we understand each other." The first mercenary to reach him never saw the strike coming. Aldric's blade took him across the throat as he dismounted, dropping him instantly. The second man had his sword half drawn when Aldric's pommel shattered his nose, sending him sprawling. But there were too many of them. A crossbow bolt whistled past his ear as he rolled behind a stone water trough. Another buried itself in the wooden manor door with a solid thunk. Aldric counted at least 3 crossbowmen among the attacker's professional soldiers, who knew how to coordinate their assault. He managed to reach the manor's front entrance, using the heavy oak door as a shield while he assessed his options. Through the windows, he could see mercenaries surrounding the building, checking for other entrances. It was only a matter of time before they found the cellar. "Sir Aldric," Captain Rourke called out. "This doesn't have to end for you. Surrender the woman, and you'll be allowed to live." Instead of answering, Aldric smashed one of the front windows and dove through it, rolling to his feet in the main hall. He could hear boots on the roof. They were coming from multiple directions. The first mercenary through the front door walked into Aldric's sword thrust. The second managed to parry, but Aldric's riposte opened his shoulder to the bone. But even as they fell, more were entering through the windows and the kitchen door. The manor became a maze of deadly encounters. Aldric used his knowledge of the layout to his advantage, striking from unexpected angles and retreating through doors the attackers didn't know existed. But he was accumulating wounds, a cut along his ribs, a gash on his sword arm, bruises from near misses with crossbow bolts dot. It was during the running battle through the upper floors that he heard the sound he had been dreading, shouting from the direction of the cellars. They had found the hidden entrance. Abandoning stealth, Aldric charged down the main staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time. He reached the cellar entrance just as Captain Rourke emerged, dragging Princess Alara by her arm. Martha and Thomas were nowhere to be seen. Hopefully they had escaped through the mine passage. "Let her go," Aldric commanded, his sword pointed at Rourke's throat. "I think not." Rourke pressed a dagger against Alara's neck, drawing a thin line of blood. "Drop your weapon, or she dies." Alara's eyes met Aldric's across the cellar entrance. In them, he saw not fear, but determination. She mouthed a single word: "Go." Instead, Aldric lowered his sword. "Wise choice," Rourke said. "Now kick it away." As Aldric complied, Alara suddenly twisted in her captor's grip, driving her elbow into his ribs with enough force to make him grunt and loosen his hold. It was the move Aldric had taught her during their training sessions, using an attacker's expectations against them. The moment of distraction was all Aldric needed. He lunged forward, tackling Rourke around the waist and driving them both to the ground. The captain's dagger skittered across the stone floor as they rolled, each trying to gain advantage. Rourke was stronger, but Aldric was more experienced. He managed to get his hands around the captain's throat, squeezing until the man's struggles began to weaken. But before he could finish it, a crossbow bolt took him in the shoulder, spinning him away from his opponent. "Enough," Rourke gasped, getting to his feet. "Take them both. Lord Vance will want to question the knight before he dies." As consciousness faded, Aldric saw Alara being dragged away by 2 mercenaries. He had failed to protect her, failed to keep his promise. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the sound of horses' hooves carrying her back into captivity. When he awoke, Thornwick Manor was burning. Thomas knelt beside him in the courtyard, his face grim with soot and worry. "They fired it before they left," the young man explained. "Martha and I got out through the mine passage, but by the time we came back—" "How long?" Aldric asked, struggling to sit up despite the crossbow bolt still protruding from his shoulder. 2 hours, maybe 3. They're heading north, toward the capital." Aldric looked at the flames consuming his home, the place where he had found peace after the war's horrors. Everything was burning again, just as it had 7 years ago when the kingdom first descended into chaos. But this time, it would not retreat. "Help me up," he told Thomas. "We have a princess to rescue and a kingdom to save." The journey to the capital took 3 days of hard riding, with Thomas supporting Aldric when the pain from his shoulder wound threatened to overwhelm him. They followed the mercenaries' trail north, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to ensure they didn't lose the path. Martha had insisted on coming with them, arguing that a group including a woman would draw less suspicion than 2 men traveling alone. She also possessed practical skills they would need knowledge of herbalism to tend Aldric's wound, connections among the servant networks in the capital, and a sharp eye for the kind of details that often meant the difference between life and death in hostile territory. On the second night, as they made camp in a grove of oak trees, Aldric finally allowed Martha to properly tend his shoulder. The crossbow bolt had been removed, but the wound was showing signs of infection. "You need proper medical attention," she said, cleaning the injury with firm, practiced movements. "This poultice will help, but if fever sets in, we keep moving," Aldric interrupted. "Every hour we delay is another hour they have to break. Her. And what good will you be to her if you collapse from blood poisoning?" Martha retorted. "Use your head, boy. This rescue requires planning, not just determination." Thomas looked up from sharpening his sword, a weapon he had never used in anger, but now carried with grim purpose. "What's our plan when we reach the capital?" "We can't exactly storm the palace." Aldric had been wrestling with the same question. Lord Thorn mentioned there are still loyalists in the city, people who remember what the kingdom was like before the war, who might support a legitimate claim to the throne. If they're willing to risk their lives for a princess most people believe is dead, Martha pointed out. "She's not dead," Aldric said firmly. "And once people see her, once they recognize the royal bloodline, support will follow." Martha gave him a look that suggested she found his optimism touching but naive. "Hearts and minds are won slowly, sir. Aldric, the battles are lost quickly when you're outnumbered 100 to 1. The capital had changed dramatically since Aldric's last visit. What had once been a thriving center of culture and commerce now bore the scars of prolonged political instability. Many of the great houses had shuttered their city mansions, preferring the safety of their country estates. The streets were patrolled by mercenaries rather than the royal guard, and an air of suspicion hung over every interaction. They entered the city separately, with Martha posing as a traveling healer seeking work, Thomas as a young farmer looking for employment, and Aldric as a veteran seeking an audience with the regent about land grants. It was a thin disguise, but it would have to suffice. Their rendezvous point was the Brass Swan, a tavern in the artisan quarter that Martha remembered as friendly to those who opposed the current regime. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Willem, recognized Martha immediately despite the years that had passed. "Martha Thornfield," he said quietly, using her maiden name. "I heard you'd gone to ground in the borderlands." "Times change," she replied, "as do circumstances. We need information, Willem, about recent arrivals at the palace, about Lord Vance's activities." Willem glanced around the tavern, ensuring they weren't overheard. "Vance brought in a prisoner 2 days ago. High security, straight to the palace dungeons. Word is it's someone important, someone he's been hunting for years. Any chance of getting close to the dungeons? Not directly. But there might be another way." Willem leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Lord Thorn arrived in the city yesterday. He's been asking careful questions about the same things you are. They found Lord Thorn in his temporary quarters at the Silver Hart Inn, a respectable establishment that catered to minor nobility visiting the capital. Marcus Thorn was a man in his 40s, lean and sharp-eyed, who had survived the wars. Chaos by being smarter than his enemies and more careful than his allies. "Sir Aldric," he said as they were ushered into his private dining room, "I was hoping you would come. Though I confess I'm surprised you're still alive after Thornwick." "Surprised or disappointed?" Thorn smiled wryly. "Relieved, actually. I have a proposition for you, but it requires someone with both military experience and a personal stake in the outcome." "I'm listening." "Tomorrow night, there's to be a formal court session. Regent Prince Aldric will be receiving petitions from various noble houses, and Lord Vance is expected to present evidence regarding a matter of succession." Thorn paused meaningfully. "I believe he intends to produce your princes as proof that House Drakmore is truly extinct." Aldric felt cold understanding wash over him. "A public execution." Worse, a forced confession that she's an imposter, followed by execution for treason. It would eliminate any future challenges to the regent's legitimacy while demonstrating the fate of those who dare oppose him. Then we stop it. Easier said than done. The palace will be heavily guarded, and Vance is no fool. He'll have contingencies in place. Thorn leaned back in his chair, studying Aldric intently. But there might be a way. I've been cultivating certain relationships within the palace staff, people who remember the old king fondly and have grown tired of the regent's rule. What do you need from me? Access to the princes before the court session. If we can get her out of the dungeons and into the Great Hall during the formal proceedings, if she can demonstrate her legitimacy before the assembled nobles, it might tip the balance in our favor. Martha spoke up from her place near the door. That's assuming she's in any condition to demonstrate anything. After 3 days in Vance's custody, she may not be capable of coherent speech, let alone royal bearing. Then we pray she's stronger than her captors realize. Thorn replied grimly. The plan that emerged over the next several hours was desperate but possible. Thorn's contacts could provide access to the palace through the servants' passages. Martha would pose as a healer summoned to tend the prisoner, allowing her to assess the princess's condition and potentially provide aid. Aldric and Thomas would position themselves in the Great Hall during the court session, ready to act when the moment came. There's one more thing, Thorn said as they prepared to leave. Something I discovered today that changes the situation considerably. He produced a document from his traveling chest, an official-looking parchment with multiple seals and signatures. This is a copy of the regent's original succession decree, filed 7 years ago. The one that declared House Drakmore extinct and established his right to rule as caretaker. Aldric examined the document, noting the elaborate calligraphy and formal language. What am I looking for? The date, Thorn said simply. Aldric found it at the bottom of the page and felt his breath catch. The decree was dated 3 days before the massacre at the royal palace. He declared his niece dead before she was actually killed, Martha said, understanding immediately. This proves the attack was planned, not a spontaneous uprising. More than that, Thorn continued. It proves the regent has been lying about the circumstances of his rise to power. This document, presented to the right audience, could destroy his legitimacy entirely. Aldric stared at the parchment, seeing not just words, but the key to everything they needed to accomplish. Where did you get this? Someone in the palace archives who believes in justice more than job security. The original is still in the files, but its existence isn't widely known. Thorn's expression was grim. The person who provided this copy is taking enormous risks. If we fail tomorrow night, it won't just be the princess who dies. As they left the Silver Heart, Aldric found himself thinking about Catherine's warning, that some secrets were too dangerous to keep. The document they now carried was exactly that kind of secret evidence that could topple a government, or get them all executed for treason. But as they walked through the darkened streets of the capital, passing the shuttered shops and guarded patrol routes that spoke of a kingdom living in fear, Aldric knew there was no choice. Princess Alara represented more than just legitimate succession. She represented the possibility of returning to a time when the throne served the people rather than the other way around. Tomorrow night, they would either restore the rightful heir or die in the attempt. Given the choices the kingdom faced, Aldric found himself strangely at peace with those odds. The palace dungeons lay 3 levels beneath the Great Hall, accessible through a maze of servants' corridors that dated back to the original construction 2 centuries earlier. Martha had memorized the route from sketches provided by Thorn's contact, but navigating the passages in darkness while carrying supplies for a wounded prisoner proved more challenging than anticipated. She wore the simple brown robes of a palace healer, complete with the leather satchel of medicines that would explain her presence if questioned. The story was simple. Lord Vance required the prisoner to be conscious and presentable for tomorrow's court session and the regular dungeon. Physician was indisposed with fever. 2 guards flanked the heavy oak door that led to the lower dungeons. Martha approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being summoned at odd hours for urgent medical matters. Lord Vance sent for a healer, she announced, producing a sealed letter with an impressive wax seal. Another contribution from Thorne's network of sympathizers. The first guard examined the letter carefully before nodding to his companion. Cell 7. The prisoner's being uncooperative, so you may need to exercise caution. Martha descended stone steps that grew damper and colder with each level. Torches provided minimal light, casting dancing shadows on walls that wept with condensation. The air carried the familiar prison sense of unwashed bodies, stale bread, and human despair. Cell 7 was larger than the others, suggesting it was normally reserved for prisoners of importance. Princess Alara sat in the far corner, her wrists chained to iron rings set into the wall. Her clothing was torn and dirty, and dark bruises marked her face and arms. But her eyes, when they met Martha's, were alert and defiant. "I'm here to tend your injuries," Martha said quietly, kneeling beside the princess and opening her medical satchel. "You're not a palace healer," Alara observed, her voice hoarse but steady. "No, I'm not." Martha began examining the visible wounds with gentle, professional touches. "I'm here with Sir Aldric. We're getting you out of here." For the first time since Martha had entered the cell, hope flickered across the princess's features. "Aldric is alive? I thought when they took me from Thornwick, wounded but alive, and very determined to see you restored to your rightful place." Martha began applying salve to the worst of the bruises, working with practiced efficiency. "Can you walk? Can you speak clearly for an extended period?" "I can do what needs to be done." Ilara's voice carried the steel of royal determination, even in these dire circumstances. But the chains, Martha produced a small vial from her satchel, along with a thin metal tool that looked suspiciously unlike any medical instrument. "Lord, Thorne's people are quite resourceful. This acid will weaken the metal enough for you to break free when the time comes, but it needs several hours to work." As Martha applied the corrosive substance to the chain links, Alara leaned closer. "What's the plan?" "Tomorrow's court session. Vance intends to present you as proof that House Drakmor is extinct, either by forcing a confession that you're an imposter or by demonstrating that the real heir is broken beyond recognition." Martha's voice carried grim determination. "We intend to give him a very different demonstration. The court will be full of nobles who profit from the current arrangement. Even if I prove my identity, what makes you think they'll support my claim?" Martha smiled, the expression sharp in the torchlight. "Because we have evidence that will destroy the regent's legitimacy entirely. A document that proves he orchestrated your family's massacre for personal gain." Alara's breath caught. "Uncle Aldric signed his own death warrant? In a manner of speaking, yes. The question is whether you're prepared to be the one who delivers it." For a long moment, the princess stared at the stone wall of her cell, her expression cycling through emotions Martha couldn't fully read. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that transformed her from victim to sovereign. "I've spent 7 years running from who I am, believing that survival meant abandoning my birthright. But perhaps survival and duty aren't mutually exclusive after all." Meanwhile, in the great hall 3 floors above, Aldric and Thomas were completing their own preparations. Posing as petitioners seeking an audience about land grants, they had gained access to the palace during the afternoon's preliminary sessions. The hall was magnificent soaring arches, tapestries depicting the kingdom's history, and the throne itself, carved from a single block of black marble. But what caught Aldric's attention was the careful positioning of guards throughout the chamber. Vance had planned for contingencies, posting armed men at every entrance and exit. Any disruption would be met with immediate, overwhelming force. "Too many guards," Thomas murmured as they took their assigned places among the other petitioners. "If we try to fight our way out, we won't be fighting our way out," Aldric replied quietly. "We'll be fighting our way to the throne." Lord Thorne appeared at his elbow, having approached through the crowd with practiced stealth. "Martha succeeded in her mission. The princess will be ready when the moment comes. But there's been a complication." "What kind of complication?" "The regent has moved up the timeline. Instead of tomorrow evening, the session begins in 2 hours." Vance was concerned about security leaks. Thorne's expression was grim. "We're going to have to improvise." Aldric felt the familiar pre-battle calm settling over him. "Then we improvise." "What's our signal?" "When they bring in the princess, she'd be wearing a white dress, the traditional garb for someone about to be executed for treason. If she's ready to act, she'd touch her left shoulder where the birthmark is. If she needs more time, she keep her hands clasped." The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. More nobles filed into the great hall, their conversations creating a low buzz of anticipation. Servants moved efficiently through the chamber, lighting additional torches and arranging seating for the most important attendees. The throne remained empty, awaiting the regent's entrance. Finally, a trumpet fanfare announced the beginning of formal proceedings. Regent Prince Aldric entered through the main doors, flanked by his personal guard and walking with the measured pace of someone who wielded absolute authority. He wore the circlet of regency, not quite a crown, but a clear symbol of his power. Behind him walked Lord Vance, resplendent in court attire that spoke of wealth and influence. And behind Vance, flanked by 2 guards, came Princess Alara. The transformation was startling. Gone were the dirty rags and broken posture of the woman Aldric had rescued from the slave market. In the white dress, with her hair properly arranged and her bearing erect, she looked every inch the royal heir she had been born to be. The bruises on her face only emphasized her dignity, evidence of suffering worn without surrender. As she entered the hall, her eyes swept the assembled crowd until they found Aldric. For just a moment, their gazes met across the vast chamber. Then, deliberately, she touched her left shoulder. The game was about to begin. Regent Prince Aldric took his place on the throne, the irony of his name not lost on anyone who remembered the princess's father. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "We gather tonight to witness the final resolution of a matter that has plagued our kingdom for 7 years. Lord Vance stepped forward, his voice projected to reach every corner of the chamber. "Your Majesty, I present to you the woman who has been spreading seditious rumors about her identity. She claims to be Princess Alara Drakmor, rightful heir to the throne of Valdris." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles. Some leaned forward with interest, others exchanged meaningful glances, and a few appeared genuinely shocked. The possibility that a Drakmor heir had survived was politically explosive. "Let her speak," the regent commanded. "Let the court hear these claims for themselves, so that all may witness how completely House Drakmor has fallen." Princess Alara stepped forward, her chains clinking softly in the sudden silence. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of generations, of royal breeding. "I am Alara Drakmor, daughter of King Aldric III, rightful heir to the throne you now occupy through murder and treachery." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. In the shocked silence that followed, Aldric prepared to change the course of history. The great hall erupted in chaos. Nobles rose from their seats, voices raised in shock, anger, and calculation. Some called for immediate execution of the pretender, while others demanded proof of her claims. The regent's guards moved closer to the throne, hands resting on sword hilts as they assessed the crowd for potential threats. "Silence!" Regent Prince Aldric's voice cut through the tumult with practiced authority. The court will maintain order, or guards will restore it. The hall gradually quieted, but tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Every person present understood. They were witnessing a moment that would reshape the kingdom's future. Lord Vance stepped forward, his expression a mask of calm confidence. "Your Majesty, this woman's claims are easily disproven. Princess Alara Drakmore died 7 years ago with the rest of her family. This is clearly an impostor, trained to exploit the kingdom's grief for personal gain. Then let her prove her identity," called out a voice from the assembled nobles. "Lord Pemberton." Aldric realized, a man whose lands bordered the former royal estates and who had reason to remember the princess personally. "Very well," the regent said, settling back on his throne with the air of a man confident in the outcome. "Present your evidence, pretender. Show us why we should believe you are who you claim to be." Princess Alara stepped forward, her chains clanking but her bearing regal despite her circumstances. The white dress, meant to mark her as condemned, instead seemed to emphasize her dignity and royal bearing. "I am Alara Drakmore, born in the 23rd year of my father's reign. I bear the royal birthmark of House Drakmore, a dragon rampant on my left shoulder, placed there by divine providence to mark the true line of succession." She turned slightly, pulling the fabric of her dress to reveal the scarred but still visible mark. Several nobles leaned forward to examine it, and Aldric heard sharp intakes of breath from those who recognized its significance. "Birthmarks can be forged," Vance said dismissively. "Scars can be created to order. What else do you offer as proof?" "I offer knowledge that only a member of the royal family would possess." Alara's voice grew stronger, more commanding. "I know that my father kept a private journal hidden behind the loose stone in his chamber's eastern wall. I know that my mother's favorite song was the Nightingale's Lament, which she hummed while tending the rose garden. I know that my brother Marcus had a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on his right wrist, which he covered with a leather bracer, because he thought it unmanly. The details were intimate, personal, the kind of knowledge that could only come from years of shared family life." Aldric watched the faces of the older nobles, many of whom had known the royal family personally, and saw recognition beginning to dawn. But it was Lord Pemberton who provided the crucial confirmation. "The rose garden," he said loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. Queen Isabella's rose garden was her private sanctuary. She allowed only family members to enter, and she did indeed tend it personally. He stood from his seat, his voice carrying the weight of certain knowledge. "This woman speaks truth. I remember her as a child, visiting the palace with my own daughters. The murmur that ran through the hall was different, now less skeptical, more awed. The possibility that House Drakmore truly had survived was beginning to take hold in the collective imagination. Regent Prince Aldric's composure cracked slightly. "Even if she is who she claims, and I grant no such thing, she is still a traitor to the crown. She disappeared during the kingdom's darkest hour instead of standing with her people. She abandoned her duties when the realm needed leadership most. I was 10 when they slaughtered my family," Alara replied, her voice cutting through the hall like a blade. "I survived because loyal servants died protecting me. I disappeared because powerful men, some of whom may be in this very hall, wanted me dead to secure their own ambitions." She turned to face the assembled nobles directly, and Aldric saw in her bearing the princess she had been born to benot. Broken, not afraid, but magnificent in her righteous anger. "I have spent 7 years in captivity, in slavery, in exile. But I have learned things in those years that no princess raised in palace luxury could ever know. I have learned the price of tyranny, the value of loyalty, and the strength that comes from surviving what should have broken me." As she spoke, Aldric noticed movement at the edges of the hall. Lord Thorne was positioning himself near one of the side entrances, while other sympathizers made subtle adjustments to their positions. The moment of truth was approaching, but it was what happened next that nobody expected. From somewhere in her dress, Princess Alara produced an object that gleamed in the torchlight, a golden scepter, ornately carved and unmistakably royal. The scepter of truth, thought lost with the rest of the royal regalia. "I offer one final proof," she said, holding the scepter high for all to see. "This is the scepter of truth, carried by every rightful monarch of Aldric for 3 centuries. According to the ancient laws, it can be held only by one of true royal blood. Any pretender who grasps it will find their hands burned by divine fire." The hall fell absolutely silent. Regent Prince Aldric leaned forward on his throne, his face pale. "That's impossible. The scepter was destroyed with the rest of the royal treasury." "Was it?" Alara asked, and for the first time since entering the hall, she smiled. "Or was it hidden away by loyal servants who knew this day would come?" She raised the scepter higher, and as she did, the ancient metal began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected torchlight. The scepter's glow intensified, casting ethereal light throughout the great hall. Gasps echoed from the assembled nobles as they witnessed something most had dismissed as mere legend: the ancient magic that bound the royal bloodline to the artifacts of state. "Impossible," Lord Vance snarled, but his voice carried uncertainty now. "Parlor tricks and stage magic." His words were cut short as Princess Alara's chains suddenly shattered. The acid Martha had applied finally completing its work. The breaking metal rang like bells through the silent hall as the princess stepped forward, unbound and glorious in the scepter's light. "The scepter of truth recognizes its rightful bearer," she declared, her voice carrying new authority. "I am Alara Drakmor, and the first claim the throne that is mine by right of blood and birth." Regent Prince Aldric lurched to his feet, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Guards, arrest this pretender. This is treason of the highest order." But the guards hesitated, staring at the glowing scepter with awe and uncertainty. In their hesitation, Aldric saw his opportunity. "My lords and ladies," he called out, rising from his place among the petitioners, "before you choose your path, hear the full truth of how the current regent came to power." He produced the document Lord Thorn had provided, holding it high for all to see. "This is a copy of the succession decree that established Prince Aldric's right to rule. Note the date 3 days before the massacre that supposedly necessitated his regency." The implications hit the assembled nobles like a physical blow. Conversations erupted throughout the hall as people grasped the significance of what they were seeing. "This document proves that the massacre was planned, not a spontaneous uprising," Aldric continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "Prince Aldric declared his niece dead before ordering her family's murder. He seized the throne through premeditated treachery." Lord Vance drew his sword, the steel ringing as it cleared its sheath. "Enough lies. This ends now." He lunged toward Princess Alara, but Aldric was already moving. His own blade met Vance's in a clash of steel that rang through the hall. The two men fought with desperate intensity, Vance seeking to eliminate the evidence of his crimes, Aldric protecting the woman he had sworn to defend. Around them, the great hall exploded into chaos. Some nobles drew weapons to join the fray, while others fled toward the exits. The regent's guards found themselves facing not just a handful of rebels, but a significant portion of the assembled court who had suddenly switched sides. Upon seeing proof of their ruler's betrayal, Thomas appeared at Aldric's side, his sword ready despite his inexperience with actual combat. Martha emerged from behind a pillar where she had been hiding, a crossbow in her hands, acquired from a fallen guard and aimed at anyone who threatened the princess. But it was Princess Alara herself who commanded the center of the battle. Still, holding the glowing scepter, she stood before the throne with absolute composure, her voice rising above the clashing steel. "Prince Aldric of House Drakmore," she called out, using her uncle's full name and title. "You stand accused of regicide, treason, and usurpation. How do you answer these charges?" The regent turned toward her, his face a mask of hatred. "I answer with the only truth that matters. Strength conquers right. Power determines legitimacy. Your father was weak, and weakness has no place on the throne. Then you confess your crimes before this assembled court?" "I confess to saving the kingdom from rulers who would have led it to ruin." He raised his sword, advancing toward his niece. "And I will finish what I started 7 years ago." But as he moved to strike, the scepter of truth flared with brilliant light. The regent stumbled backward, crying out as if burned, his sword clattering to the floor. Whatever power resided in the ancient artifact, it would not permit the spilling of royal blood by a usurper's hand. Princess Alara stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of divine judgment. "Uncle, you have confessed your guilt before the court and before the ancient powers that guard our bloodline. Justice demands your death." She raised the scepter, and for a moment it seemed she would strike him down where he stood. But then she paused, her expression softening slightly. "But mercy is the mark of a true ruler," she continued. "You will abdicate immediately, renounce all claims to the throne, and accept exile to the monastery at Ravenshollow. Your life is forfeit, but I grant it to you as a gift. Use it to seek forgiveness for your crimes." The defeated regent looked at his niece with something that might have been respect. "You are more your father's daughter than I gave you credit for." Throughout the hall, the fighting had ceased as everyone stopped to witness this moment of royal justice tempered by mercy. Lord Vance, disarmed and bleeding from multiple wounds, was held by Lord Thorne's men. The other conspirators were either dead, captured, or fleeing through whatever exits remained open. As the immediate crisis passed, Princess Alara turned toward the throne that had been denied her for 7 years. The scepter of truth continued to glow in her hands, casting light that seemed to promise a new dawn for the kingdom of Aldric. The rightful heir had returned, and the long nightmare of civil war was finally ending. 6 months had passed since Queen Alara's coronation, and the kingdom of Aldric was slowly healing from nearly a decade of civil war and political chaos. Aldric stood in the renovated throne room, watching as his queen, for she was truly his queen now, in every sense that mattered, held court with the same grace and wisdom that had marked her father's reign. The throne itself had been rebuilt according to her specifications, incorporating elements from the old seat of power, but designed to represent hope and renewal rather than mere authority. Gone were the heavy fortifications and suspicious atmosphere that had characterized the region's rule. The palace doors stood open during daylight hours, allowing citizens to bring their concerns directly to their sovereign. The royal guard had been reconstituted with veterans who had proven their loyalty during the Restoration, and the old traditions of accessible monarchy were being carefully restored. "Sir Aldric," Queen Alara called out as the morning's petitioners departed. "A moment, if you please." He approached the throne with the easy familiarity of someone who had earned his place through shared trials, rather than inherited privilege. The formal title of Royal Protector had been created specifically for him, acknowledging both his military service and his unique relationship with the crown. "The ambassador from Westmark has arrived," she said, settling back in her throne with a slight smile. "He brings a marriage proposal from Prince Edmund, along with assurances of eternal friendship and a truly impressive dowry." "Another one?" Aldric asked dryly. "That makes 7 this month. 8, actually." "You missed the courier from the northern reaches." Her smile grew broader. "Apparently, word has spread that the restored Queen of Aldric is both unmarried and inclined toward forgiveness of former enemies. Every eligible prince within 1,000 miles sees an opportunity. And how does your majesty intend to respond to these generous offers?" Queen Alara rose from her throne, moving to stand beside him at the great window that overlooked the capital. The view showed a city transformed, markets bustling with commerce, construction crews rebuilding structures damaged during the war years, and people moving about their daily lives without the fear that had marked the region's rule. I intend to remind them all that marriage alliances are tools of statecraft, not romantic convenience, she said, and that some bonds are forged in circumstances that political expedience cannot match. She turned to face him directly, and Aldric saw in her eyes the same woman he had rescued from the slave market, but transformed by responsibility and healing into someone magnificent. Besides, she added with a mischievous glint, I've grown quite fond of having a royal protector who actually understands the meaning of protection. Most princes would see the role as ceremonial. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martha, now bearing the official title of royal housekeeper, but still maintaining the same practical efficiency that had served them so well at Thornwick. Behind her came Thomas, whose battlefield courage had earned him a commission in the reformed Royal Guard. Your Majesty, Martha said with a slight curtsy that somehow managed to convey both respect and familiarity. The preparations for the Harvest Festival are nearly complete. The Merchants Guild has confirmed participation from all the major trading centers, and Lord Thorn reports that attendance will likely exceed our best estimates. The Harvest Festival was Queen Elara's innovation, a celebration designed to mark not just the seasonal gathering of crops, but the kingdom's gathering together after years of division. It would be the first major royal celebration since her father's time, and its success would signal to the world that Valdris had truly returned to stability. Excellent, the Queen replied. And what news from the borderlands? All quiet, Thomas reported. The lords who chose exile over oath-breaking seemed to be honoring their agreements. No unusual military movements, no reports of conspiracy or sedition. It was a testament to Queen Elara's approach to justice that so many of her uncle's supporters had been offered the choice between death and exile. Some had chosen to stay and swear new oaths of loyalty, and most of these had proven sincere in their conversion. Others had departed for distant lands, preferring uncertainty to the humiliation of serving the woman they had tried to destroy. Lord Vance had chosen neither option. He had died in the palace dungeons 3 months earlier, reportedly of a fever, though some whispered that guilt and despair had been the true causes of his demise. Queen Elara had ordered a proper burial despite his crimes, another gesture that had won her respect among those who valued mercy over vengeance. As evening fell and the palace settled into its quieter rhythms, Aldric found himself walking the corridors where he had once fought for his life and the woman he loved. The scars of that battle had been carefully repaired, but he could still remember every clash of steel, every moment when victory or defeat had hung in the balance. He paused before the portrait gallery, where new paintings now hung alongside. The old Queen Elara's official coronation portrait showed her holding both the scepter of truth and the crown of kings, but it was the smaller painting beside it that drew his attention. It depicted the moment of her first proclamation in the Great Hall, with himself and their small band of supporters surrounding her as she claimed her birthright. Do you ever regret it? Queen Elara's voice came from behind him, soft in the corridors. Silence. Regret what? He asked, turning to find her watching him with that penetrating gaze that missed nothing. The simple life you had at Thornwick. The peace you found after the war. All the things you gave up to follow a broken woman's impossible dream. Aldric considered the question seriously, as she deserved. I gave up isolation for purpose, he said finally. I traded solitude for something worth fighting for. And I exchanged guilt over past failures for hope in future possibilities. He moved closer, near enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. Most importantly, I discovered that some broken things can be made whole again if given enough care and time. Even broken nights, especially broken nights. She smiled then, the expression transforming her face from regal to radiant. "In that case, Sir Aldric, I believe we should discuss the terms of your permanent employment. The position of royal protector comes with certain expectations and privileges that we haven't fully explored." "I serve at the pleasure of the crown," he replied formally, though his own smile ruined the serious effect. "Indeed you do," Queen Alara agreed. "And it would please the crown very much if you would join her for dinner. As her protector, of course." "Of course." As they walked together toward the royal apartments, Aldric reflected on the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter in a slave market had led to the restoration of a kingdom and the redemption of two souls who had lost their way in the darkness of war and suffering. Outside the palace windows, the first stars appeared in the deepening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to prove that mercy and justice could coexist, that broken things could indeed be made whole. But tonight, a knight and his queen would share a simple meal and plan for a future that neither had dared to imagine just months before. Sometimes, Aldric thought, the smallest acts of kindness really did change the course of history. The kingdom of Valdris was whole again, and so were the two hearts that had helped to heal it.